Hello there and welcome to this video. This video is going to be called an introduction to the British jazz fusion scene part 2 because I started talking on this video. I thought it would only last 20 minutes and I spent a long time on part 1 really setting out my stall and bringing in all sort of my prejudices and personal viewpoints on jazz fusion and to simplify those, I really think that the idea that the British jazz fusion is seen as a silly thing because fusion is the mixture of different styles, and rock music and progressive rock music and heavy metal all came out of a scene that was happening in the 60s in London, which was a fusion scene, and jazz was in there, and artists like John McLaughlin and also John Heisman and Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce were all jazz musicians working on that. And not only were they creating rock music, actually forging rock music, they were actually creating jazz fusion. So this country's played a very important part. I then made a point that there's a sort of snobbishness and insecurity in the British jazz scene which does not make it able so much to recognise innovation. So it sort of passed fusion by. So the musicians that really have become household names in jazz fusion had to leave the country and go to America to really make their name, and that has to be considered. And it's so for me, the bands that I'm about to discuss now, when we're picking those up, if we're looking at a band like Isotope, the reason why they're there is because they weren't a success. They're not a Weather Report or a Return to Forever or Mavish Yorkshire. And the reason why they're not a success is because they've languished within the British jazz scene, of which fusion is an afterthought. Okay? If we go back to the 60s, in the UK, a whole bunch of really, really important musicians, and they're fusing all this stuff together, and that's going to create a whole bunch of music forms. These music forms are going to take over the world. Now this is really led by the Beatles. So when I talk about the history of British jazz fusion, we're really talking about one half of the history of jazz fusion itself. The Beatles are very, very important because the Beatles take over the world. Before the Beatles, the UK's probably had a handful of #1 hits in America. And the Beatles come out and they take over America, and then the #1 slot, the #2 slot, the #3 slot, the #4 slot is all the Beatles, right? And that, the commercial world works in a way that all the commercial eyes move to the UK. What's the UK doing? And there's these bands there like the Rolling Stones and the Kinks, and there's the Small Faces and Cream, right? Someone like Jimi Hendrix spots this and he leaves America because he can't get anywhere, you know. And he goes to where it's happening, where rock music's being created. And what do we mean by rock music? We mean heavy rock music, heavy metal, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin. We mean progressive rock, King Crimson, yes, Jethro Tull. And we mean jazz fusion, right? So there's a whole ton of musicians creating jazz fusion. Some of them who are working in the jazz scene in the 60s, they're taking their lead from what is going on in America. I think of a musician like Ian Carr. Ian Carr's a huge Miles Davis fan. Ian Carr's real importance in terms of jazz history will always be the biography he wrote on Miles Davis, which is a standard read for anyone interested in jazz. He's hearing what Miles is doing. He hears Bitches Brew, he hears In a Silent Way, which is ironic because he's working in London, and a few years before he could have possibly been, you know, rubbing shoulders with John McLaughlin. John McLaughlin's gone over to the States and he's given Miles the thing Miles needs to come up with this thing. And so one of the early fusion bands that must get mentioned is Ian Carr's Nucleus. And when I listen to Ian Carr's Nucleus, what I hear is he's an incredible player and it's really exciting stuff, but it's very derivative of what Miles is doing. It's that insecurity I hear, you know, of having to take your lead from what the Americans are doing. But Nucleus is a very, very important band in the history of British jazz fusion if we want to now start dividing these bands off. Nucleus, the album Belladonna, is very important because of its inclusion of Alan Holdsworth. It's possibly Alan's second recording and first high-profile-ish recording. You know, so I would say that Belladonna is perhaps Alan's introduction to the world. He was in a strange sort of pop band called Higginbotham's Wrench, which made an album in 1969. But Alan Holdsworth's interesting. It's actually interesting to sort of latch onto him because he plays in Nucleus and then he goes on to play with Tempest. Now, Tempest was a band by John Heisman. John Heisman is a fantastic drummer that has also come out of this UK scene. I'm just going to call it the UK London scene. He's there as well. You know, I think John Heisman took over from Ginger in the Graham Bond band. I'm not too sure here. Right at the limits, maybe. He definitely took over from somebody in some band, and I think he took over Ginger from another Graham Bond band. I think it was maybe John Mel. Yeah, no, it's Graham Bond, which of course John McLaughlin was playing with. He plays with John McLaughlin on Things We Like by Jack Bruce. John Heisman's a fantastic drummer, and in the late 60s he forms a band called Colosseum. And Colosseum are a fusion band, but Colosseum are interesting because what they do is they climb under the progressive rock banner. Now, I think in the late 60s, early 70s, the progressive rock banner was a name for a genre that was perhaps wider than what we've narrowed it down to. So progressive rock back then, I think, was basically any type of rock music that was pushing any sort of boundaries. So David Bowie would be classed as progressive rock back then. And I think that's a great term because that's what British rock music was. Rock music was different to rock and roll. This really comes from the Beatles because people were able to open the doors, you know. So when I listen to a band like King Crimson, 21st Century Schizoid Man, 1969, there's a whole ton of fusion on that track. Without a doubt, there's that free jazz solo and then running into the really complex runs. That is more fusion, I would say, but a lot of the things that, say, Gary Burton's doing at the same time in America. One hugely influential and important progressive rock band is Soft Machine. And Soft Machine come out late 60s, they're touring with Hendrix, and they're making very experimental, quirky pop music, psychedelic pop music to start off with. But as time goes on, all those musicians that have come out of that scene that have all those jazz credentials behind them, you know, Robert Wyatt is a jazz musician, and they start to slowly go more and more towards fusion. You know, by the mid-70s, when Alan Holdsworth plays on with them in Bundles, they are an out-and-out fusion band, but they're hiding within the progressive rock world. Alan Holdsworth's an interesting musician because with him, you can hear with Soft Machine and Tempest, which is basically the follow-on to Colosseum, a much more, so even more fusiony version of Colosseum. We can see Holdsworth sort of going through all these British jazz groups. Now, why didn't these British jazz fusion groups, why aren't they mentioned in the same breath as Weatherport and Mavish Yorkshire? It's because they didn't sell the records. It's just the lack of success. All right. When I was a kid, now this is me countering my own point here because I don't think that's actually the case. When I was a kid in the UK in the 70s, around about 77, 78, when I was 9, 10 years old, I became very, very interested in music. And I didn't know anything about heavy metal or jazz fusion or prog. I'm just listening to stuff in the charts and albums that my mum and dad were buying. And it was very interesting in 1978 because my mum and dad went out and bought a number of albums that everybody was buying, right? They bought War of the Worlds, Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds. Now for me that is progressive rock, and that was possibly one of my earliest introductions to progressive rock. I can remember my dad sitting down and we got all the story out and we listened to the whole album like it was a film, and if that was basically then when I discovered Yes and Close to the Edge. That was the thing that I discovered with Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds. Another band they were listening to was Sky, and Sky was a sort of a band created by the classical guitarist John Williams, and this was a huge band here in the UK. I don't know how big it was in the States, but here it was like on the television all the time. And Sky was sort of classical music and rock mixed together, but there was a huge dose of fusion there. But in 1978, my mum and dad got an album by Andrew Lloyd Webber called Variations. Right, so I'm going to talk about variations now. Those of you who want me to talk about Isotope and Backdoor and Brand X and all that, you might not get that on here. And the reason is because Brand X were bigger. I think Brand X were bigger because they had a more of an international recognition. But the other bands, very obscure bands. So am I right to go and get into discussing these, you know, bands like Morrissey Mullen and all these British jazz fusion? Or should I talk about Variations by Andrew Lloyd Webber? I feel like I need to talk about that first, so I'm going to. So in 1978, my mum and dad bought an album called Variations by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Everyone bought this album. It was a huge hit. There was a single release and it was a hit record. That single then became the theme to the South Bank show, and anybody in the UK of a certain age will know that. And that sort of octave slap bass line. Everyone knows this. This is like a huge record. So 78, 79, I was listening to a lot of pop music, and it was just at the point where I was getting interested in drumming and guitar playing, and I was starting to check out certain bands. Around about 1979 I discovered heavy metal, and that was possibly around the time that I would have been listening to Variations. Now, bear in mind that Andrew Lloyd Webber is the richest musician in history, okay? Yes, you've got your Kanye Wests and you've got your Beyoncés and you got your Pink Floyds, and they've all made millions. But if you want to know who the richest musician is in the world, it's Andrew Lloyd Webber. And that's, of course, come from, I would imagine, the copyrights he gets on all the musicals that he's played on, you know, and the amount of times those tunes get covered, and, you know, he must have those tunes playing in every country in the world. But in 1978, he made an album where he basically took the Variations by Paganini and he set those to music with his brother Julian Lloyd Webber taking the sort of melodies on the cello. So he put that onto cello and he made this album called Variations. It was a huge hit. So I, of course, I'm just getting into Motorhead and Whitesnake, and I think they're amazing. Can't believe how great they are. So I go and stick my mum and dad's Variations album. And on there were moments that were so heavy and out there, I was just blown away what was going on. And there was one section where they ran into a number of different time signatures, and the guitar was sort of improvising over this, and I was totally baffled by this. Now the reason for this, because the band on that was John Heisman's Colosseum 2, and I think that is an incredible band, and they made a number of albums in the mid-70s, Electric Savage, is it Brave New World? Not too sure what the other album was, but I had those albums as well, and I think Colosseum 2 really need, you know, a mention. But for me, it was their work on Variations that absolutely blew me away. Now the musicians on there were John Heisman, and it was his wife Barbara Thompson. Now Barbara Thompson had a fusion band, British fusion band called Paraphernalia, and they would regularly crop up on British television in the early 80s. So they were an influence on me as well. But also on that album, you had Gary Moore. Now Gary Moore made an album, his first album is called Back on the Streets, and on there is a huge dose of jazz fusion, you know, with the incredible Simon Phillips on drums. Now there's another musician that I think has become almost like a household name for fusion at the moment. I think every fusion fan is listening to the new Protocol album. That's just, you know, got nothing to do with British jazz. You know, Simon Phillips is an international jazz fusion musician. He's working in London, very much like Holdsworth. He's working in London in the 70s, but as soon as he goes to America and starts work there, he becomes a household name. I think it's John Mole on bass on Variations, but also in Colosseum you have Neil Murray, and of course Neil Murray went on to play bass in White Snake, right? He also, because I've met Neil Murray and he told me he also played for a short time in Bruford's band with Alan Holdsworth, and those Bruford albums, that should be classed in British jazz fusion, right? So as I get to the end of this video, that potted history of jazz fusion is pretty awful, really. I do apologise, because when I start to think about it, I am drawn to the things that we don't class as British jazz fusion that are successful, and I would rather discuss on this channel the bands that was commercially successful and sold records, because they, in the end, they are the ones that influence, you know. There's a whole ton of obscure jazz fusion all the time. People point me to it, and to be honest, I don't know that much about it. You know, what's interesting is when you start to go into British jazz fusion, what you see is that later on those musicians are often end up working in a whole bunch of other areas. A lot of them went into sort of heavy rock and heavy metal and started working in that. A lot of them are around the guys, or either as mentors or directly involved with Level 42. I'm now going to end up this video with Level 42, because Level 42 were a huge band who had tons of hit records. And again, who crops up in that band at one point on the album Guaranteed? Alan Holdsworth, there he is again. Level 42 in the early 80s were an out-and-out fusion band. They sound like Return to Forever, they sound like Stanley Clarke. And they introduced a sound in the early 80s, that jazz fusion sound that was incredibly influential on British dance music. And here in the UK we had a scene called acid jazz, and acid jazz was just hugely indebted to jazz fusion. And in the late 80s, early 90s, you had bands like the Brand New Heavies, you had bands like Mother Earth, you had bands like Corduroy. And Corduroy were an incredible band for here, because here they were, their first single, or one of their early singles, was a jazz fusion funk take on Motorhead, right? Because this thing really, once you get outside of the idea of British jazz, you start to see how hugely influential we are as a country. Jamiroquai is one of the biggest bands of all time. You know, it's hard to find a country where Jamiroquai haven't sold hundreds of thousands of records. They were hugely successful all over the world. Now, are Jamiroquai jazz fusion? Of course they're jazz fusion. So what is this thing where we don't want to class Level 42 as jazz fusion? We don't want to class, you know, Andrew Lloyd Webber's Variations as jazz fusion. We don't want to class Jamiroquai as jazz fusion, or Level 42. I just said Level 42. We don't want to class these things as jazz fusion, do we? We want to box it off, and we want to say, you know, go and check out Backdoor, because that's British jazz fusion, right? No, what that is unsuccessful British jazz fusion. And that insecurity and sort of snobbishness is the thing that's always been apparent to me when you try and talk about this. So, I've spent another 20 minutes trying to get to this, but I have spoken about British jazz fusion, which for me would be John McLaughlin, Alan Holdsworth, Colosseum, Sky, Level 42, Jamiroquai. Okay? Now, that acid jazz scene is very, very influential. There's a whole ton of artists that have come out of that. Its influence on dance music, electronic music, but also jazz is very, very important. And I'm probably opening a door right? Maybe a back door. I'm opening a door. I keep mentioning back door because they were a British fusion band in the early to mid 70s. Had some really key players come through them, and I don't know that much about them. I'm aware of them, I've listened to them. Whether I can talk with authority on a video like this, I don't think I can. But the reason why they were never totally on my radar, because there was so much other jazz fusion to listen to, you know, and so maybe I'm skirting around the issue a little bit here. But my point is there's huge slabs of stuff which really is British jazz fusion, which doesn't come under the radar. You know, it's a bit like America ignoring the Mavish Orchestra, Herbie Hancock, Return to Forever, and Weather Report, because they were successful, and sticking them in other genres so we don't have to talk about it. That's my take. So here's the end of this video. I've got to it. You know, I'm at the end of part 2 of my introduction to British jazz fusion. I'm going to endeavour to cover it as much as I possibly can, but I might not be covering some of the artists. You know, do I need to have a good look at Jamiroquai? I love Jamiroquai, always have done. Anyway, this is the end of the video. I hope you like it. If you like these rambly talks, then please like and subscribe, and then I will do more of them. If nobody likes it, I won't do any more. I'll just go back to ranking the best 11th house albums, because I think that's what everyone really wants, really, isn't it? That's what you all want, really, isn't it? Anyway, thank you very much. See you on the next video.